Look at her demeanor in the beginning. She was so humbled, right? Yeah. So appreciative to be in the position.
Yes, Meghan, and I hope you're watching right now. I hope you're watching, Meghan, because you are the shit stain of fucking humanity.
The tears didn't fall on camera. That's the part nobody expected. According to this account, when the news reached Meghan that her brother had finally gone on record, really gone on record, there was no dramatic public response, no carefully staged counterstatement, no inspirational quote posted online. There was just silence, the kind that settles in a room after something irreversible has been said out loud.
A video yesterday or the day before saying that Meghan and Harry are on the rocks. Well, I think I called that quite a bit ago, and
because this time, it wasn't a tabloid rumor. It wasn't an anonymous source. It wasn't a royal commentator guessing from the sidelines. It was her brother. And not just speaking, but opening doors he'd kept closed for years. Thomas Markle Jr. didn't ease into it. He didn't hedge. He didn't soften the language to seem reasonable. In this telling, he spoke with the tone of someone who believes history has finally caught up to a warning he gave long ago. A warning everyone laughed at. A warning that cost him his reputation. A warning that, 7 years later, looks disturbingly accurate. Back in 2018, before the world wrapped itself in fairy tale headlines and wedding spectacle, Thomas Jr. did the unthinkable. He wrote an open letter to Prince Harry telling him not to marry his sister. Not privately. He called her fake, a bully, a user. He said she would isolate Harry from his family, destroy relationships, and leave wreckage behind her. At the time, the reaction was brutal. He was painted as bitter, jealous, a man trying to insert himself into a moment that didn't belong to him. Social media shredded him. The press dismissed him. And Harry? Harry ignored him completely.
I would never wish that upon my worst enemies.
But here we are now, in December 2025 in this timeline, and the ruins Thomas Jr. described are no longer hypothetical. The royal family fractured, Harry estranged from his brother, a permanent exit from royal life, lawsuits, interviews, accusations, burned bridges stretching from Buckingham Palace to Hollywood. And then there's the father, 81 years old, emergency surgery, a blood clot so severe his leg turned black and blue, doctors racing against time, a 3-hour operation ending with an amputation that changed his life forever, ICU, sepsis risk, days where survival wasn't guaranteed. Thomas Jr. was there for all of it. He was the one sitting in sterile hospital rooms, the one talking to doctors, the one watching his father wake up without part of his body, and trying to understand how an elderly man rebuilds his life from that point forward. He lives with his father. He's the caregiver, the one doing the physical, emotional, exhausting work. And Meghan? In this narrative, her response arrived through representatives, a letter. No call, no video message, no flight, just words filtered through other people, managed like a public-facing issue instead of a family emergency. That moment, Thomas Jr. says, changed everything. Because there are things you can forgive. Distance, estrangement, old arguments. But when someone doesn't show up during a life or death moment, it redraws the emotional map permanently. Suddenly, protecting their image feels pointless. Suddenly, silence feels like complicity. That's when the book stopped being hypothetical.
Odd and horseshit. So yeah, in Hollywood, I hope you're listening too, because
sources in this world say Thomas Jr. had been approached for years. Producers, publishers, media outlets dangling opportunities to talk. He said no, over and over, not because he didn't have stories, but because he believed some lines shouldn't be crossed. Until now. Because this book, he's made clear, isn't about childhood squabbles or sibling rivalry. It's about the years no one talks about, the stretch of Meghan's life before Suits, before Harry, before royalty, the years that don't quite add up no matter how many times the official narrative is repeated. From 2004 to 2011, the story goes, she was a struggling actress, auditions, small roles, briefcase girl on Deal or No Deal, barely making rent, hustling in Los Angeles like everyone else trying to break through. And yet, photos exist. Luxury yachts in the Mediterranean, Monaco parties, exclusive events filled with wealthy older men, multiple trips, multiple locations, settings you don't casually stumble into when you're counting pennies and crashing on friends' couches. Yacht Week in Croatia, ultra exclusive, invitation only, a playground for the ultra-wealthy where access is currency and privacy is the real luxury, not something you attend by accident, not something you afford on a struggling actor budget. And Meghan has never explained it, never clarified who invited her, never explained who paid, never addressed how these trips fit into the barely getting by narrative she's told repeatedly. The photos surfaced, curiosity flared, and then silence. The story moved on. The questions were never answered. But Thomas Jr. says he remembers those years. He remembers the lifestyle, the access, the connections that appeared long before the fame did. He remembers how opportunities didn't come from endless auditions, but from relationships, from being in rooms most aspiring actors never see. Trevor Engelson, a producer, not just a boyfriend, but a gateway into Hollywood's inner mechanics. Soho House, a private members club where power circulates quietly. Marcus Anderson, a connector, a fixer, someone who knows everyone who matters in those spaces. This is how careers actually move, Thomas Jr. claims. Not through talent alone, not through grinding, through proximity to power. And once you understand that, the timeline makes sense. Suits didn't come out of nowhere. Harry didn't either. These worlds overlap in very specific places, and Soho House is one of them. Royals don't meet random strangers. They meet people vetted through layers of connection, introductions that feel spontaneous but are anything but. Thomas Jr. isn't saying this to shame. In this telling, he's saying it to contradict, to challenge the mythology, to point out that the carefully curated image of a self-made, struggling actress doesn't align with the access she clearly had.
And saying this breaching clear ethnical bounder.
And that's why this scares Meghan, because image has always been the foundation. Once the story cracks, everything built on top of it wobbles. Her Netflix show about compassion and authenticity, her speeches about healing and truth, her carefully controlled distance from her own family. It all starts to feel rehearsed. And the cruel irony? While she films content about connection in Montecito, her father is learning how to live without a leg on the other side of the world, with not all his children by his side. Thomas Jr. says that contrast is what finally broke him. Why protect someone who won't protect their own family? Why stay silent when silence only benefits the person who left? So now he's writing, not whispering, not hinting, writing. And if his 2018 warning turned out to be prophetic, the question haunting everyone isn't whether this book will hurt Meghan's image. It's whether it will finally explain how it was built in the first place. What makes this chapter of the story so unsettling isn't just what Thomas Jr. claims to know, it's how calmly he says it. In this telling, there's no glee in his voice, no sense of revenge, just exhaustion, the kind that settles into someone who's spent years watching a version of events harden into public truth while knowing it doesn't match what he lived through. He doesn't frame himself as a hero. He frames himself as someone who stayed quiet far longer than he should have. And that's where the tone of this story shifts again. Because once Thomas Jr. stopped talking about predictions and started talking about patterns, the narrative became harder to dismiss. He talks about how Meghan learned early that proximity to wealth changes outcomes, how she understood instinctively who mattered and who didn't, who could advance her and who could be discarded. In this account, he describes family gatherings where charm was switched on and off depending on who was watching, moments where warmth existed in public and vanished in private.
Thank you for joining me. First of all, how is your father, Thomas Sr.?
He claims this wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was strategy. According to him, Meghan didn't stumble into elite spaces. She targeted them. She didn't wait to be discovered. She positioned herself where discovery was inevitable, and once she no longer needed someone, they faded from her life without explanation. That includes family. Thomas Jr. says people misunderstand the estrangement. They think it was caused by media pressure or embarrassment. But in his version of events, the distancing began long before the cameras arrived. Fame didn't change the behavior, it amplified it. The world simply got a clearer view of something he'd seen for decades. And this is where the so-called yacht years become more than gossip. Thomas Jr. doesn't describe them as scandalous parties or moral failures. He describes them as transactional spaces, places where access is traded, introductions are currency, and silence is expected. Places where NDAs are normal and questions are unwelcome. He suggests those years taught Meghan two crucial lessons: how power really works and how to control a narrative. That second lesson, he says, became her greatest skill, because once she entered the public eye, every chapter of her past was simplified. Struggle was emphasized, access was minimized, connections were reframed as coincidences. Anything that didn't fit the arc of resilience and self-made success was quietly erased. And erasure, Thomas Jr. argues, is something she's very good at. Friends who no longer served a purpose disappeared. Family members became liabilities. Even entire years of her life were smoothed over until they barely existed at all. So when people ask why he's speaking now, his answer is brutally simple: because the story has become too clean to be true, and because his father almost died. That part keeps coming back.
You learn to manage it. When I take my time and say...
Thomas Jr. describes sitting in the hospital after the amputation, watching machines beep in a rhythm that felt louder than any argument he and his sister had ever had. He describes realizing that time doesn't pause for image management, that when a parent is gone, there are no do-overs, no carefully worded letters that fix what absence broke. He says something hardened in him during those nights. Not anger, resolve. Because if Meghan could stay silent now, if she could reduce a medical emergency to a handled message, then protecting her version of events no longer felt like loyalty, it felt like enabling. And here's where the pressure escalates. According to this account, publishers aren't just interested in family anecdotes. They're interested in documentation, timelines, names, places, the connective tissue between unexplained access and sudden advancement, the quiet middlemen, the social hubs where paths crossed long before the public knew they existed. They're interested in the gap between the public brand and the private reality, and Thomas Jr., it seems, is willing to fill it. That's why Meghan is described as unraveling behind closed doors, not because one more critic spoke up, but because this one can't be dismissed as a troll or an outsider. He's not speculating. He's testifying to a shared history, a shared upbringing, a front-row seat to behaviors that now look uncomfortably familiar to millions of people watching from the outside.
Girl developing a love for the stage, and they were taken by the teacher who nurtured Meghan Markle's ambition. But
for years, Meghan's response strategy has been effective. Don't engage, don't correct, let time bury the noise. But this isn't noise. This is a sustained narrative from someone who knows where the skeletons are, not metaphorically, but structurally. And that's the difference. Because if Thomas Jr. sticks to his plan, the book won't accuse. It will contextualize. It will take moments the public has already seen, the royal exit, the fractured relationships, the repeated cycles of conflict, and trace them back to a much earlier origin point, a playbook written long before Harry ever entered the picture. Which brings us to Harry. In this ordeal, Harry is not portrayed as malicious or complicit, but as someone who underestimated how deep the patterns ran, someone who believed love could overwrite strategy, who mistook secrecy for protection, who thought cutting ties would bring peace. Instead, it brought isolation. And Thomas Jr. says that's exactly what he warned about in 2018. Not because he hated his sister, but because he recognized the trajectory. The slow narrowing of a partner's world until there's no one left to challenge the narrative except the person controlling it. Now, with Harry increasingly distant from his own family and Meghan increasingly distant from hers, the symmetry is impossible to ignore. Two families reduced to one voice, and one voice, Thomas Jr. believes, is never the whole truth. That's why the final chapters of this story feel less like revenge and more like rupture. a breaking point where the curated image can no longer absorb the weight of unanswered questions. Because once a narrative depends entirely on omission, it becomes fragile. And once someone with first-hand knowledge starts filling in the gaps, control slips fast. The irony is sharp. Meghan's public brand centers on authenticity, compassion, and truth-telling. Yet the person now challenging that image isn't a critic. It's her brother, standing beside their amputee father, asking why some truths were never allowed to exist at all. And as this countdown continues, one thing becomes clear. This isn't about yachts. It isn't about parties. It isn't even about royalty. It's about who gets to decide which version of the past survives. Because once the people you left behind start speaking, the story doesn't just change, it fractures. And in the silence that follows, no amount of careful messaging can put it back together the way it was before.